Why did Belgium get so little after World War I, especially when countries like Denmark gained so much without even fighting? It's a question that might surprise you at first glance, considering Belgium was at the heart of the First World War's devastation. After all the suffering and destruction, you'd think they'd get a decent amount of compensation, right? But no, Belgium only received a small bit of land from Germany, despite the high price it paid during the war. How did that happen? Well, it's a bit more complicated than you might expect, and to understand why, we need to dig into the tangled web of post-war negotiations and the politics of compensation. Let's start with Belgium's role in World War I. Belgium didn't just suffer. It was ground zero for a brutal German occupation that lasted most of the war. Entire towns were destroyed, and civilians were left dealing with the aftermath of military conflict day after day. By the time the war ended, Belgium had endured severe destruction and losses. So, when Germany was defeated, Belgium, like other Allied countries, expected to be compensated. The obvious question is, why didn't Belgium get more land? After all, it was an occupied country, and surely it had a claim to more territory after its suffering. What about the fact that Denmark, which didn't even fight, got all this land? It's a fair question, and Belgium had every reason to expect more. But things are rarely that simple in international politics. After the war, the Allies, countries like France, Italy, and the United States, came together to discuss the future of Europe. There was a clear divide. France and Italy wanted to punish Germany harshly by stripping away its territory, while the United States, led by President Woodrow Wilson, had a different vision. Wilson wanted the new borders in Europe to be based more on demographic lines, what's known as self-determination, where people should have the right to choose which country they belong to. For Belgium, this was a tricky situation. On the one hand, there were politicians who believed Belgium deserved compensation, and they had some pretty ambitious ideas about what they should get. Some even argued that parts of northern France or the Netherlands should be Belgian, based on historical claims. But the truth is, most of these ideas weren't realistic. Belgian leaders were torn. In the south, the French-speaking politicians wanted to push for parts of northern France to be handed over. They argued that these areas had historically been part of the Spanish Netherlands, so there was some precedent. But that wasn't all. Some Belgians were also eyeing the Netherlands. Even though the Netherlands had remained neutral during the war, some Belgian politicians believed they had essentially helped Germany by allowing trade to flow through their ports. They felt that the Netherlands needed to be punished for this, and that Belgium should take control of some Dutch territory. This is where things start to get a little wild. Not only did some politicians want territory in the Netherlands that had previously been administered by Belgium, but they also wanted some extra land just as a way to punish the Dutch. Sounds a bit over the top, right? It was. And the Allies weren't exactly enthusiastic about these demands. Luxembourg and the question of annexation. But it didn't stop there. Luxembourg was another piece of the puzzle. Luxembourg had been occupied by Germany during the war, just like Belgium. So, some Belgian leaders thought it would make sense for Luxembourg to either be annexed by Belgium or at least enter into a personal union with Belgium. That way, Belgium would gain control over the territory, and Luxembourg would have a new ally. It seemed like a win-win. Except for one thing, the idea of annexing Luxembourg for the crime of also being invaded was pretty far-fetched. It wasn't going to fly with the rest of the Allies, especially since Luxembourg had its own identity and wasn't interested in becoming part of Belgium. So, while the idea floated around for a while, it didn't gain much traction. Germany, the core of Belgium's territorial claims. Now let's talk about Germany. At the end of the war, Belgium wanted compensation from Germany, and the most realistic idea was to annex some German territory. In particular, they were interested in the lands around the border with Belgium, which had been heavily occupied during the war. But even within Belgium, there were divisions about how much to push for. Some politicians had more moderate demands, just the lands that had historically been part of Belgium, or were occupied by Germans during the war. But there were more extreme voices too. Some military leaders and nationalist politicians argued that Belgium should push even further and take control of lands up to the Rhine. It was a bold idea, but it wasn't going to happen. The Allies were not about to let Belgium annex such a large chunk of Germany, especially with self-determination as a guiding principle. The principle of self-determination and why Belgium's plans failed. And that brings us to the crux of the issue. One of the key principles guiding the post-war settlement was self-determination. This idea, championed by the United States, meant that any territorial changes needed to reflect the wishes of the people living there. The problem for Belgium was that in most of the areas they were interested in, the local population didn't want to become Belgian. Whether it was in the Netherlands, France, Luxembourg, or even parts of Germany, the people living there saw themselves as anything but Belgian. So, from the perspective of the Allies, there was no way these lands were going to be handed over to Belgium. Belgium's diplomats didn't help matters either. They couldn't agree amongst themselves on what exactly they wanted. There were too many conflicting demands and no unified vision. In the end, Belgium's long list of territorial claims annoyed the Allies more than anything, and they were left with just a small slice of compensation. Belgium's gains, a little land, and some financial compensation. So what did Belgium actually get after all this? In the end, Belgium was given some territories along its border with Germany. These were lands that had been occupied by Germans during the war, and they included some key railway connections that Belgium needed. But these were small gains, and the territories themselves were pretty odd-looking, with small pockets of German land sticking out into Belgium. Belgium also received some compensation in Africa, though these gains were also relatively minor. On top of that, Belgium was given a bit of financial compensation, but it wasn't nearly enough to make up for the devastation it had suffered during the war. Essentially, Belgium was told to be satisfied with what it got and move on. The major powers had bigger concerns to deal with, and Belgium's demands weren't at the top of their list. Conclusion. Why did Belgium get so little? So why did Belgium get so little after World War I? The answer is a mix of unrealistic demands, the principle of self-determination, and international politics. Belgium's leaders asked for too much, and the things they wanted often went against the wishes of the people living in those territories. The Allies, particularly the United States, weren't going to redraw borders without considering the wishes of local populations. And in the end, Belgium's long list of demands only frustrated its allies. Belgium's gains were modest, but they were in line with the broader goals of the post-war settlement. The world wasn't interested in redrawing Europe's borders too radically, and Belgium had to accept that. After all, it wasn't just about who suffered the most during the war, it was also about building a stable Europe for the future. And that's how Belgium ended up with so little, despite its central role in World War I. History is full of these kinds of twists and turns, and sometimes the outcomes are surprising. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the complex stories of history.